Manipulators do not look powerful because they are strong. They look powerful because most people are predictable. They rely on emotional reactions, visible insecurities, and the human need to be understood. The manipulator studies these patterns quietly and then feeds on them. What unsettles them most is not confrontation, exposure, or dominance. It is absence, emotional absence, psychological opacity, a refusal to play. This is why most advice about dealing with manipulation fails. It encourages explanation, assertion, or moral framing. All of these give the manipulator exactly what they want: engagement, energy, data. The moment you try to prove your strength to someone who feeds on reactions, you have already lost leverage. There is a more unsettling approach, one that does not fight manipulation, but starves it. One that does not correct distortion, but reflects it. One that removes you from the game entirely, while the manipulator continues playing alone. This is not about being passive. It is about becoming strategically uninteresting. Most manipulators operate on a simple internal economy. Attention is currency. Emotion is fuel. Reaction is confirmation of relevance. When these inputs disappear, their internal structure begins to destabilize. They escalate, probe, provoke, and distort harder, trying to extract a response. This escalation is not confidence. It is dependency. The first principle you must understand is that manipulators cannot operate in silence. They require feedback loops. When they speak, they are watching your face, your tone, your timing. When they act, they are measuring impact. If nothing comes back, they begin to doubt their control. Doubt is corrosive to them. This is why becoming emotionally neutral is so threatening. Not cold, not hostile. Neutral. Calm responses, minimal expression, unreactive posture. The manipulator reads this as a closed system. They cannot locate your leverage points. They cannot tell whether they are succeeding or failing. This uncertainty makes them uncomfortable in a way direct resistance never does. The gray rock method is often misunderstood as being boring on purpose. That is a shallow interpretation. It is not about acting dull. It is about becoming informationally barren. When you speak, you reveal nothing that can be used later. No preferences, no grievances, no emotional spikes. You answer without texture. You respond without narrative. You exist without explanation. To a healthy person, this may feel strange or even rude. To a manipulator, it feels like standing in front of a locked door with no handle. They may try charm. They may try pressure. They may try sympathy or accusation. Each tactic is designed to extract something. When nothing comes out, they experience a quiet panic. There is another layer most people miss. Manipulators often mirror others to build rapport. They adopt language, values, and emotional cues to create false alignment. When you offer no emotional surface to mirror, their strategy collapses. They cannot synchronize with emptiness. They cannot reflect what is not there. This leads to the second principle, which is more subtle and more unsettling. The mirror of emptiness. This is not mimicry. This is not mockery. It is reflective neutrality. When a manipulator projects blame, drama, or superiority, you do not counter it. You allow it to stand, unchallenged and unacknowledged. In doing so, they are forced to sit with their own output. Most people rush to correct false narratives. They defend their character, their intentions, their boundaries. This feels necessary, but it creates friction the manipulator can exploit. When you refuse to correct distortion, something unexpected happens. The manipulator hears themselves more clearly. Their exaggerations echo back at them through silence. This is deeply uncomfortable for someone who relies on external validation to regulate their self-image. Without resistance, their behavior looks excessive. Without reaction, their tactics feel hollow. The mirror is not your words, it is your lack of emotional participation. There is a reason this works. Manipulators often lack internal containment. They regulate themselves through others. When you remove yourself as a regulatory surface, they lose equilibrium. They may accuse you of being distant, cold, or arrogant. These accusations are not observations. They are bids for re-engagement. Your discipline here is critical. You do not explain your silence. You do not justify your restraint. You do not clarify your intentions. Explanation is a form of submission in these dynamics. It signals that you still care about how you are perceived. The moment you try to be understood, you re-enter the system. Another uncomfortable truth is that manipulators escalate when they feel ignored. This escalation is often framed as concern, confusion, or confrontation. It is none of these. It is a stress response. They are attempting to reassert relevance. If you mistake escalation for strength, you will respond emotionally and restore their control. Stillness here is not weakness. It is containment. You are not suppressing yourself. You are choosing not to export internal states into an environment that weaponizes them. This choice requires discipline because it denies the ego its usual outlets. Understand this clearly. Outsmarting a manipulator is not about beating them at their own game. It is about refusing to provide the conditions their game requires. When you become uninteresting, unreactive, and unreadable, you do not dominate them. You outgrow them. By the end of this part, recognize the shift that must occur. You stop seeing manipulation as something to confront. You begin seeing it as something that collapses under silence. You do not argue with distortion. You allow it to exhaust itself. In the next part, we will move deeper into the psychological signs that indicate a manipulator is losing control, how to maintain your neutrality under provocation, and how to recognize the moment when disengagement becomes permanent rather than tactical. When a manipulator begins to lose control, the first thing that cracks is not their behavior, but their composure. They become less precise. Their timing slips. Their tactics grow louder, less elegant, more desperate. This is the phase where most people make their fatal mistake. They sense weakness and rush in. They believe the moment has arrived to confront, expose, or finally assert themselves. In doing so, they hand the manipulator a fresh surge of energy at the exact moment they were starving. You must understand this law clearly. Manipulators do not collapse from resistance. They collapse from irrelevance. As emotional neutrality takes hold, you will notice subtle changes. The manipulator repeats themselves more often. They recycle old narratives. They probe for reactions using exaggerated language or sudden shifts in tone. This repetition is not confidence. It is a signal that their usual levers are no longer producing movement. Silence has turned their tactics into echoes. At this stage, your discipline matters more than ever. Neutrality is not something you achieve once and then forget. It must be maintained under pressure. Manipulators are skilled at provoking guilt, urgency, or confusion when they feel ignored. They may accuse you of being distant, unkind, or changed. These accusations are carefully designed to reinsert you into an emotional frame. If you defend yourself, you validate the accusation's relevance. If you explain yourself, you confirm that they still matter. The correct response is not coldness. It is flatness. Calm acknowledgement without engagement. Short responses without narrative. You do not deny their interpretation, and you do not accept it. You simply do not participate in it. This forces the manipulator to confront a rare experience. Their words no longer shape the room. Another sign of destabilization is escalation disguised as vulnerability. The manipulator may suddenly appear wounded, misunderstood, or abandoned. This shift is not growth. It is a tactical inversion. When dominance fails, they try sympathy. When intimidation fails, they try intimacy. The goal remains the same: access to your emotional bandwidth. This is where many men falter, especially those who value empathy or fairness. They mistake emotional displays for sincerity. But sincerity is consistent. Manipulation is adaptive. When you see rapid changes in posture, tone, or identity, you are not witnessing honesty. You are witnessing strategy. The mirror of emptiness becomes essential here. You do not absorb their emotional display, and you do not reject it aggressively. You allow it to exist without resonance. This creates a psychological vacuum. In that vacuum, manipulators often begin to reveal more than they intend. Their language becomes self-referential. Their complaints circle back to their own needs. Their narratives grow incoherent. This incoherence is not accidental. Without a reflective surface, their internal fragmentation becomes audible. You are not exposing them. They are exposing themselves to the silence. Another critical discipline during this phase is resisting the urge to educate or diagnose. Many people, once they recognize manipulation, want to label it. They want to explain patterns, name behaviors, or prove awareness. This is a trap. Naming the tactic does not neutralize it. It invites debate. Debate restores engagement. Engagement restores leverage. Silence, when combined with consistency, does something far more powerful. It forces the manipulator to choose between escalating indefinitely or disengaging. Both outcomes serve you. Escalation reveals instability to others. Disengagement ends the dynamic. Either way, you do not need to act. You will also notice that manipulators begin to test boundaries more aggressively when neutrality holds. They may violate time, space, or conversational norms. They may push for immediate responses or force confrontations. These are attempts to bypass your restraint. Your response must remain measured. You do not react faster. You do not explain delays. You do not apologize for distance. You normalize it through repetition. Consistency is what turns neutrality into armor. One calm response can be dismissed as mood. 10 calm responses redefine the relationship. Over time, the manipulator stops trying to extract depth because depth no longer exists. What remains is surface-level interaction that offers them nothing. It is important to understand that this process often feels uncomfortable internally. You may feel unnatural, detached, or even guilty. This is because you are breaking a familiar pattern of emotional reciprocity. Manipulators rely on this discomfort. They count on your desire to restore harmony. When you tolerate discomfort without acting on it, you regain control of your internal state. Another law to observe is how others react when the manipulator loses influence over you. Often, third parties will attempt to mediate or interpret. They may pressure you to explain yourself or to smooth things over. This is secondary manipulation, not always intentional. Your stance remains the same: minimal explanation, no justification. You are not obligated to make others comfortable with your boundaries. At a certain point, something decisive happens. The manipulator stops investing energy. Conversations become shorter or cease entirely. Attention shifts elsewhere. This is not victory in a dramatic sense. It is resolution. The dynamic dissolves because it no longer produces returns. This is also the moment where many people feel tempted to reassert themselves, to reclaim dignity through confrontation or closure. Resist this impulse. Closure is not given by manipulators. It is taken through disengagement. Any final statement, no matter how measured, reopens the loop. By the end of this part, you should recognize the pattern clearly. Manipulation does not end because you win an argument. It ends because the manipulator can no longer access you psychologically. Neutrality starves. Silence exposes. Consistency closes the door. In the next part, we will examine the final phase: how to disengage completely without triggering retaliation, how to recognize when silence has done its work, and how to rebuild internal clarity after prolonged exposure to manipulation. When silence has done its work and neutrality has reshaped the dynamic, you enter the most dangerous and misunderstood phase: disengagement. This is where manipulation truly dies, but it is also where retaliation is most likely if you move carelessly. Many men fail here not because they lack strength, but because they underestimate how deeply manipulators fear losing access. Disengagement is not an announcement. It is not a conversation. It is not a moral stance. It is a gradual removal of availability that feels natural, boring, and unremarkable. The less dramatic it is, the safer and more effective it becomes. Manipulators do not respond well to finality. When they sense a clean break, they often escalate with one last surge of intensity. This surge can take many forms. They may attempt reconciliation, offering warmth and nostalgia. They may spread subtle narratives about you to others, framing themselves as confused or concerned. They may provoke you directly, hoping to trigger a reaction that reopens the channel. All of this is designed to test whether silence is permanent or just another phase. Your task during disengagement is not to manage their behavior. It is to manage your consistency. Consistency is what convinces the manipulator that access is truly gone. Sporadic engagement keeps hope alive. Emotional explanations reignite investment. Sudden coldness invites obsession. But calm distance, maintained over time, communicates something devastatingly clear. The game is over, and no announcement will be made. One of the most important principles here is reducing exposure without explanation. You reply less frequently, but not abruptly. You shorten interactions, but without hostility. You stop volunteering information, but you do not become secretive. The goal is to make interaction unprofitable, not suspicious. When nothing dramatic happens, there is nothing to attack. Internally, this phase can feel disorienting. Manipulative dynamics often last long enough to become familiar. When they end, the absence of emotional turbulence may feel empty rather than peaceful. Some men mistake this emptiness for loss and reopen contact to fill the silence. This is a mistake. What you are feeling is not loss of connection. It is withdrawal from constant stimulation. Manipulation creates intensity. Silence creates space. Space feels uncomfortable until you learn to inhabit it. As disengagement continues, you may notice intrusive thoughts about whether you were too harsh, too distant, or unfair. This self-doubt is a residue of long-term emotional conditioning. Manipulators train others to over-explain and self-correct. When you stop doing that, the mind initially rebels. Let the thoughts pass without action. You do not need to resolve them. You need to outlast them. Another critical element in this phase is social positioning. Manipulators often rely on shared environments to maintain influence. Workplaces, friend groups, or family structures can be used as indirect access points. You do not need to isolate yourself completely, but you do need to become less predictable. Vary routines, reduce overlap when possible. Keep interactions public and neutral. Privacy is where manipulation regrows. If confrontation becomes unavoidable, your response should remain minimal and non-emotional. You do not recount history. You do not defend your character. You do not accuse. You state boundaries as facts, not arguments. Facts do not invite negotiation. Arguments do.
At some point,
you will notice something subtle but profound. The manipulator's image of you begins to fracture. Without access, they cannot update their internal narrative. They may cling to outdated perceptions, treating you as if nothing has changed, or suddenly shift to indifference. Both are signs of detachment. Neither requires your response. This is also where power quietly returns to you, not in dominance but in autonomy. Your thoughts become clearer. Your reactions slow down. Decisions feel less reactive and more deliberate. This is not because you have defeated someone else, but because you have reclaimed mental territory. However, there is one final trap to avoid. Do not replace one manipulative dynamic with another. Some men, once free, seek intensity elsewhere, mistaking calm for boredom. Be cautious of relationships that feel immediately consuming or emotionally charged. Manipulation thrives on urgency. Stability grows slowly. Use this phase to rebuild internal calibration. Notice how your body feels without constant tension. Notice how silence begins to feel spacious rather than threatening. This is the baseline you protect going forward. Disengagement is complete when you no longer think about the manipulator's reactions, when their opinions feel distant rather than provocative, when silence is no longer a tactic but a natural state. At that point, the dynamic has ended, regardless of whether they acknowledge it. In the final part, we will address what comes after manipulation, how to rebuild boundaries that do not harden into isolation, how to recognize subtle manipulation early, and how to carry this discipline into all areas of life without becoming cold or disconnected. What comes after manipulation is not dominance, withdrawal, or emotional numbness. It is calibration. This final phase is about rebuilding a way of relating to the world that is neither porous nor armored, neither naive nor cynical. Most men make one of two mistakes after escaping manipulation. They either become hyper-defensive, treating every interaction as a threat, or they overcorrect into isolation, confusing peace with disconnection. Both paths quietly hand power away again. The goal is not to become unreachable. The goal is to become unreadable. Unreadability is not secrecy. It is the absence of emotional leakage. It is the ability to engage without broadcasting your internal state. Manipulators rely on tells, tone shifts, over-explaining, visible frustration, the urge to correct misperceptions. When these disappear, manipulation has nothing to anchor to. What remains is presence without access. This begins with internal boundaries. Before you manage how others interact with you, you must manage how much authority you give to their reactions. Manipulation only works when someone else's emotions are allowed to dictate your internal weather. When approval, tension, or conflict immediately changes how you feel about yourself, you are vulnerable. The work now is to decouple self-regard from external response. This does not mean becoming indifferent to others. It means slowing the moment where you internalize their behavior. When something provocative happens, you pause. You observe. You let meaning arrive later, rather than instantly assigning it. This delay alone dissolves most manipulative attempts. Urgency is the manipulator's oxygen. Deliberation starves it. As you rebuild, pay attention to early signals. Manipulation rarely begins loudly. It starts with subtle imbalances. Conversations that leave you feeling slightly diminished. Requests that assume compliance rather than invite choice. Emotional reactions that feel disproportionate to the situation. You do not need to confront these immediately. Simply note them. Awareness weakens repetition. One of the most powerful habits you can develop is neutral clarification. When something feels off, you ask simple, calm questions without accusation. You do not challenge intent. You seek clarity. Manipulators struggle here because their tactics depend on assumptions and emotional momentum. Clarification forces everything into the open without creating conflict. Equally important is learning when not to clarify. Some behaviors do not deserve investigation. Repeated disrespect, passive pressure, or boundary testing should be met with reduced access, not dialogue. You do not owe everyone understanding. You owe yourself coherence. As your boundaries stabilize, something unexpected happens. Your presence changes. You speak less, but when you do, it lands more firmly. You react slower, which makes others more careful. You no longer rush to be understood, which makes people pay closer attention. This is not intimidation, it is gravity. Gravity does not announce itself, it is felt. This is also where relationships begin to filter themselves naturally. People who relied on emotional leverage drift away. People who value clarity and steadiness move closer. You do not need to manage this process. It happens on its own when your behavior becomes consistent. Manipulation cannot coexist with consistency. Be careful not to romanticize hardness. Strength does not require coldness. You can be warm without being open, kind without being available, engaged without being exposed. The difference lies in choice. When you choose engagement rather than being pulled into it, power stays with you. There will still be moments of testing. A manipulator may reappear months later under the guise of growth or nostalgia. Familiarity can be tempting. Remember that patterns matter more than promises. Observe behavior over time, not language in a moment. Silence gives you the space to see clearly. Finally, understand this. The true victory is not that manipulators lose interest in you. It is that you lose interest in proving anything to them. When their approval feels irrelevant and their disapproval feels informational at best, the dynamic has fully collapsed. From that place, silence is no longer a tactic. It is simply your natural state when nothing meaningful needs to be said. You are no longer reacting. You are selecting. And selection is the quiet signature of autonomy.